Today's episode is brought to you by We Break You Buy. Interested in sports cards and memorabilia? Check out We Break You Buy on TikTok. We Break You Buy is a small operation run by three brothers, offering spots for a chance at winning some incredible sports cards and memorabilia. That's We Break You Buy. Check it out today on TikTok. Well, here we go. We're live now. Welcome to Why Wasn't It Better? I am your host, Patrick Darms.
And I'm your co-host, Anton Paras.
And returning to the podcast is a longtime repeat guest, Tyler Van Fossen. Welcome back.
Welcome back, Tyler.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Hope everyone out there had a healthy and happy holiday. This will be an episode that you hear after Christmas. And Anton, I think this is our last episode of 2023. This will be coming out a day or two before New Year's. So
yeah, well, I hope everyone has their New Year's resolutions all drafted up. Everyone's ready for a fresh new year and just closing out the year strong. And we're closing out the year strong with this one.
Oh, yeah. This is technically the 40th anniversary of the film that we're covering today, Never Say Never Again, which is an unofficial James Bond movie. This is basically the second part of what is our double header, the first being Thunderball, the episode that you either previously heard or the episode that we last published before this one. I understand that not all of our listeners listen to our episodes in order, and of course you don't have to. But I think in this case, it would behoove you to do so because this is an unofficial remake of Thunderball, and it came out 18 years after Thunderball.
And before we start to unravel the web, that is the grand storyline. Of course, Tyler, you are a fantastic repeat guest. Wanted to give you the platform. Is there anything you wanted to update our listeners on or anything you wanted to plug to the listeners?
I have literally nothing to plug. I live a boring, solitary life with my wife and two dogs, so
That's okay.
I appreciate the opportunity, but nothing to push here. Just excited to get back into another podcast again. I don't know that I'm the super James Bond fan that Pat would be, but somewhat versed in all these movies. Pat, I think about 15 years ago, you and I tried to watch all these. I don't know how far we got through all the Bond movies, but I don't remember it being many of them. So we'll see how this goes.
And it was in order of release?
I believe so, yes.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, this was not one we watched. This would be, I don't want to step on anything in terms of my opinion of this film, but let me just say this would not be one of the first Bond movies that I introduced to anyone who hadn't seen them before.
I think this is one of those Bond films that you actually leave out when recommending the films to folks.
Yeah. Well, it's very hard to explain this one, right? Because Bond fans know the story of this film, but casual fans probably don't. And it's a bit confusing. They're like, well, it's an unofficial Bond movie. And you're like, yeah. And they're like, well, how does that work? And you're like, well, there was a lawsuit and it's really a remake of Thunderball. And then by that point, you probably lost someone. They're like, whatever, Connery's in it. It's a Bond movie. And of course, it is a real Bond movie. I know there are certain fans in the Bond community who don't consider this a real Bond movie, which I think is an absurd opinion. It stars Sean Connery as the character of James Bond. It's a James Bond movie.
He introduces himself in the first few minutes of the movie as Bond, James Bond. I don't think it's very hard to argue that this is certainly a Bond movie.
But probably in the same way people look at the original Casino Royale and say that wasn't a Bond movie.
You mean the one from the 60s?
Right, exactly.
Have you seen it?
I have. It's a mess. It's a mess. Well, here we are with Never Say Never Again. Patrick, any admin before we dig in? Or are we ready to just jump in?
I think we covered the admin. This is going to be it for our 2023 episodes. Just, we appreciate all the love that we've gotten so far, and we have so much planned for 2024. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year. When the criminal organization Spectre steals 2 nuclear warheads and holds the world hostage, the British government reactivates the Double O's. An aging James Bond returns to the field. released on October 7th, 1983 by Talia Film and Warner Brothers, directed by Irvin Kershner, screenplay by Lorenzo Semple Jr., based on an original story by Kevin McClory, Jack Whittingham, and Ian Fleming, starring Sean Connery, Klaus Maria Brandauer, Kim Basinger, Barbara Carrera, Bernie Casey, Edward Fox, and Max von Sydow. A budget of $36 million, which is $110 million adjusted for inflation, with a box office at $161 million. $491 million adjusted for inflation. Now, we touched on it a little bit, but Pat, why was this movie chosen?
Well, there was no way we weren't going to cover this film. Imagine if J.K. Rowling had collaborated with some no-name wannabe Hollywood producer to write a screenplay for the very first Harry Potter film, but ended up going nowhere, and then Rowling foolishly forgot to credit the producer when publishing the novel that was based on the screenplay. And then, through a bizarre legal battle, imagine that wannabe producer won the legal right to make their own Harry Potter adaptation. That is what happened with Never Say Never Again. Let's wind the clocks back to 1983. Imagine this. You get two different James Bond movies in the same year, played by two different actors. How cool is that? Not only was Roger Moore starring in his sixth film, Octopussy, we also got the return of the OG, Sean Connery, back in the saddle. This was a huge deal. The hype for this film was enormous, and that's why we picked it. Because not only was it hyped, but this is not really considered a good Bond movie by really anyone in the community. It certainly has its fans, but you never really see this one ranked highly. It was a remake of Thunderball, which was, at that point, adjusted for inflation, the most financially successful film of the series, and still is to this day. I think maybe apart only from Skyfall. There was no way we weren't going to cover this. I have been looking forward to covering this one for a long time, and I felt that if we were going to cover Thunderball, we might as well cover this as a doubleheader because they are so closely tied together.
Very well said, Pat. And one thing I wanted to add there is it's just so cool to be able to look at a film like Never Say Never Again because, like you said, this is a very unique situation. And one thing about this film in particular, it's great to always talk about Bond films. And with that, look at the lens of Bond film fans. And Pat, you'd say that's a pretty rabid fan base, right?
Oh, yeah. The Bond community is a very active, a very healthy community. It's always great to participate in Bond discussions. As you know, Anton, it's my favorite film series. Some of them are more fun to talk about than others. Some of them are better than others. But I think this one's going to be a lot of fun to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to almost put our listeners put your caps on to 1983 and just imagine if you're a massive Bond fan and you find out that your guy Sean Connery is back in the saddle as James Bond. Like, I wonder what kind of divide that built in the franchise, in the fandom.
It would have been a heck of a summer, right? You would have gotten Octopussy. You would have gotten The Right Stuff. You would have gotten War Games. You would have gotten Return of the Jedi. And then you would have gotten Never Say Never Again in the fall. How cool is that? This was originally going to be released the same time as Octopussy, but it ultimately got pushed back to the fall. And Octopussy actually ended up with the larger box office gross of the two. Most people thought that Connery would win that box office battle, but ultimately Roger Moore did. Tyler, what interested you about watching Never Say Never Again and discussing it?
So I think I hinted at this a bit in the beginning, but I don't have a deep history of watching these early Bond films. Being very aware of the more recent Daniel Craig ones and enjoying them for the most part. Taking a look at these older movies where they lay into the kind of the cheesiness, the gimmicky Bond, the weird tools and little instruments he gets. This one has the camera and the watch and all that stuff. They're a good general overall fun watch, and it's hard to deny Sean Connery in anything. We talked about in our last podcast to do you guys Rising Sun, the Sean Connery effect on just about everything. It is funny to watch him, and see his early quips, because in a lot of those later movies he's been in, he is, like the short one-liner and the super sarcastic character and all those. So it's very funny to see him kind of pile up these things earlier, but at the same time too, it's when you think of James Bond, he's like the James Bond in my mind. The svelte, sweet talking, maybe a little creepy older gentleman at points, especially in this movie. But yeah, it's I do enjoy these movies. This one maybe not as much as some of the other ones, but definitely interesting to talk about, and not to mention all the history and all the backroom dealing that went into getting this movie made. And at the very end of all this, one of the pieces of research I found that I'll expand upon a little bit with the two Bonds potentially bumping into each other because they were buddies is part of some of the funnier research I've dug into with this movie. So yeah, always interesting to talk about some of these Bond movies.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I knew I had to have you on for at least one Bond film because, like you said, we talked about Rising Sun earlier this season and how much we enjoyed Connery. And it's like, well, might as well talk about his most iconic role. He's probably the only actor who played Bond who really had a entirely separate career outside of James Bond, right? Like Daniel Craig has had a lot of success outside of Bond, but he hasn't been in a lot of films. It's less than you'd think. Whereas Connery, he had this entire post-Bond career. He won an Academy Award and he like reinvented himself as, the older mentor type in the late 80s and 1990s. And this film was released in a very transitional phase of his career where his career was basically in a slump when this came out. He was doing a lot of character actor work. He hadn't had a genuine bona fide hit as a leading man in quite some time. And I don't think Connery would have ever admitted this, but it's possible that he needed this film as much as it needed him because there was no possibility of this being made without his participation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we could probably all pinpoint the point in which, before Never Say Never Again, that the decline in Sean Connery getting more roles was probably in 1974 after Zardoz.
Who could forget that classic?
That's a fun little wink at the audience. So listeners, look it up if you've never heard of it.
I would imagine most people haven't heard of Zardoz, but they've certainly seen the famous picture from the set of Zardoz with Sean Connery in let's just call it a costume.
Pirate costume?
Almost like Fatima Blush.
It's certainly a way to describe it.
Well, let's get into the production history of Never Say Never Again, because this is one of, if not the most complicated production histories that we've covered so far. And Anton, let me say, it's not the most complicated because nothing will ever top Cleopatra.
That's fair. That is very, very fair. I think maybe this is one of the juiciest, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So in the previous episode, we talked about Thunderball and the multi-layered legal battle that resulted in that film getting made. And if any of the listeners are interested in this particular subject, I would highly recommend reading a book called The Battle for Bond. It is a very detailed account of the legal battle surrounding Thunderball and the making of these two particular films. It goes into a lot of detail. Eon Productions is certainly not happy about its existence. I don't think it's currently in print, but you can find it on eBay. And like I said, if you have any interest in this at all, it is really worth a read. Back to the legal battle, basically, that allowed this particular film to come into existence. So Kevin McClory, who was he ultimately served as the executive producer as this film, he won the right to make his own James Bond movie in the early 1960s. Again, if you want to hear more details about that, check out our Thunderball episode. But just to recap briefly, if McClory wanted to make a movie, he now had the right to use anything in the original screenplay, as well as the novel that Fleming wrote based on the screenplay. This included Spectre, this included Blofeld, and most crucially, the character James Bond and everything associated with Bond that appears in the screenplay and the novel. In short, McClory had the right to make his own independent Bond movie if he wanted, as many times as he wanted, provided that he drew from the original screenplay or the novel. The legal ruling said verbatim, quote, "The exclusive right to use the character James Bond as a character in any such script or film of Thunderball," end quote. So this exact wording would later prove useful. A major part of the deal that Eon made with McClory when they made Thunderball in 1965 was that he agreed not to make any future adaptation for a period of 10 years. And it is worth pointing out, Eon, meaning Cubby Broccoli and Saltzman at that point, they just assumed that this would be enough time to deter McClory from ever pursuing his own version, right? They never actually seriously considered that he would try this. Fast forward to 1976, when the 10th Bond film, The Spy Who Loved Me, was entering production. Blofeld and Spector were originally written to be the film's villains, but when McClory found out about this, he sued Eon, and the court ruled that he alone had all copyrights to Blofeld and Spector. For this reason, Stromberg ended up being the main villain in that movie, and this is the main reason why Spector and Blofeld never appeared in a Bond movie after 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. Of course, not until 2015 Spectre. But this legal ruling in the 70s, this is what triggered McClory's decision to adapt Thunderball into his own version. You know, he could use anything in the novel and the screenplay that he worked on, so he had to be careful to avoid using anything specifically from the 1965 movie version. But by this point, he had been sitting on his own screenplay for years, and the script initially focused on Spector shooting down aircraft over the Bermuda Triangle before taking over Liberty Island and Ellis Island as staging areas for an invasion of New York City through the sewers under Wall Street. That sounds absolutely bananas.
And that's just it, right, Pat? There's like, and that's the end of this web of just, you know, legal battle, and they were able to go peacefully and smoothly into the next few years.
If only.
Oh.
This script was purchased by Paramount Pictures in 1978. However, problems arose. Eon and United Artists accused the story of going beyond the copyright restrictions. McClory pivoted, sticking to the original Thunderball screenplay and novel. He was patient, he played the long game, he was determined to get this done. In 1980, he hired an American entertainment lawyer named Jack Schwartzman, who was the husband of Talia Shire and the father of Jason Schwartzman, who viewers probably recognize today. And also worth pointing out, he was married to, of course, Talia Shire. He was Francis Ford Coppola's brother-in-law.
And folks may remember Talia Shire as the wife of Rocky's character, or Sylvester Stallone's character in Rocky.
And Michael Corleone's deadbeat sister.
Yes, of course.
Schwartzman would end up producing the film while McClory would be credited as executive producer. In addition to the handling of the legal challenges of the script, the first thing Schwartzman did was commission a new screenplay. He hired Lorenzo Semple Jr. to write it. Semple is best known for working on the 1960s Batman series. An entire team of lawyers was involved in the writing process and would later be on set daily to ensure that things went smoothly. Schwartzman initially had trouble securing financing, as no studio was interested in competing with an official Eon-owned Bond franchise. However, this changed when he was able to convince Sean Connery to return to the role.
The most important thing was getting the right man to play Bond. So when Connery agreed to return to the role after 12 years, he negotiated a salary of $3 million. In 2023, that's $9 million. So casting and script approval and 15% of the box office. So his earnings totaled about $30 million for this in 1983. So about $90 million just for inflation. So Sir Sean did pretty well for himself.
$90 million.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's worth noting out that Connery's career as a leading man, as you mentioned, Pat, was a bit in a slump. So throughout the 1970s, he continuously starred in mostly supporting roles. His last leading hit was in The Man Who Would Be King back in 1975, and his most recent leading role, Outland, which was released in 1981, turned out to be a flop. So, you know, I'd argue, not a bad movie. Pat, I'm sure you'd agree. But
yeah, it's pretty good.
Is there a role that Sean Connery can't bring his charisma to that we couldn't enjoy? But the man's career was at a crossroads in 1983. Had Never Say Never Again failed, we likely would not have had the latter stage Connery that we've all come to know, and has, as Pat has mentioned, really revitalized Connery's career. So it's worth noting Connery originally wanted Richard Donner to direct, but Donner passed as he disliked the script. Semple Jr. ultimately left the project after Irvin Kershner was hired as director, and Schwartzman began cutting out the big numbers from a script to save on the budget. So reportedly, Francis Ford Coppola made script contributions to this. Remember that he was Schwartzman's brother-in-law. So this movie's credits state that Talia Shire acted as a consultant to the producer. So it's good to be connected. Connery was not entirely satisfied with the screenplay, so he hired his own team of writers to polish it. British television writers Dick Clement and Ian LaFrennais provided rewrites, although they went uncredited for their efforts, despite much of the final shooting script being theirs. Connery's wife is credited with the title of the film. During a conversation with her husband, during which he said he'd never return to the role again, she told him, "Never say never again." And just as the film was about to begin shooting in late 1982, Eon and the Fleming trustees made one final lawsuit to block the film's release, but the court once again upheld the original 1963 ruling. So in addition to the obvious legal quagmire, the script went through numerous drafts. Connery personally recruited Klaus Maria Brandauer to play Largo. Irvin Kershner selected former model and Playboy cover girl Barbara Carrera to play Fatima Blush. Carrera's performance as Fatima Blush earned her a Golden Globe Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress, which is a surprise.
Definitely.
Micheline Connery, Sean's wife, had met up-and-coming actress Kim Basinger at the Governor's House Hotel in London and suggested her to Connery. Rowan Atkinson's character was added by Clement and LaFrennais after the production had already started in order to provide the film with a comic relief, and I like to think as the true origin for Johnny English. A number of the crew from Raiders of the Lost Ark were also appointed, including Director of Photography Douglas Slocum, Second Unit Director Mickey Moore, First Assistant Director David Tomlin, and Art Directors Philip Harrison and Stephen Grimes. The yacht featured in the film was owned at the time by a Saudi arms dealer. Later, at one point, it was owned by Donald Trump. Schwartzman, who would be officially credited as producer, was not up to the task of handling such a large project. He was constantly having to travel back and forth to London to meet with the lawyers as a result was seldom on set. Connery ended up having to serve as de facto producer, which he was not happy about, although he later stated that it gave him invaluable experience. Now, director Irvin Kershner was critical of producer Jack Schwartzman, saying that while he was a good businessman, quote, he didn't have the experience of a film producer, end quote. And shooting lasted from September 1982 to May 1983. Folks may recognize the name Steven Seagal, who was a martial arts instructor for the film, who broke Connery's wrist while training, probably to prove he was a tough guy. The film was set for June 1983 release. Research required and the production went over budget and over schedule, finally being released in October 1983. At one point, the production ran out of money, forcing Schwartzman to pay for some things out of his own pocket. There are at least 7 deleted scenes that have never been made public. Kim Basinger later claimed, "We actually shot 2.5 more films, I bet, with all the footage we shot." This would be the last film where Sean Connery would be clean-shaven on screen. It is rumored that Sean Connery had an alternate ending to The Wink in mind. As the characters walk down the street, a man brushes by them, causing them to double take and look back at him. The camera angle shifts, and we see that it's Roger Moore, who turns to look at them and say never again. Moore and Connery were good friends, and both were willing to do it, but they were never able to convince director Irvin Kershner and the producers. So despite being a difficult project, the film did very well at the box office. It didn't outperform Octopussy, but still made it back its budget by 5 times. And, well, that's Never Say Never Again's production history.
Let's talk about why it wasn't better. Number one reason is the production. Anton, you just talked about all of the budget problems. Schwartzman being in over his head as producer. The book, The Battle for Bond, is really funny to read because he was apparently terrified of Connery. And, the book goes into a lot of details on this. Connery absolutely hated him and was completely unimpressed with his professionalism behind the scenes. And he actually went on record in an interview saying that the whole production was a, quote, bloody Mickey Mouse operation, end quote. And here's another quote that cracks me up from Connery. Quote, "There was so much incompetence, ineptitude, and dissension that the film could have disintegrated. It was like working in a toilet. What I could have done was just let it bury itself. I could have walked away with an enormous amount of money and the film never would have been finished. But once I was there, I ended up getting in the middle of every decision. The assistant director and myself really produced the picture." End quote. The experience on this, it left Connery drained, and he took the longest sabbatical of his career following this. He would not make another film for almost 3 years, which ended up being Highlander.
Oh, that was a film? I thought it was a documentary, and that was literally Sean Connery in the Highlands, just
Playing
hanging out with
an alleged Egyptian Spanish man, sort of.
hanging out with Christopher Lambert.
I really do hope you guys get to Highlander one day.
We can cover Highlander.
Well, there
That's
can
a
only
fun
be
one.
one.
Nothing brings me greater joy than knowing that the villain in Highlander is also Mr. Krabs.
What's his name? The
Kurgan.
The Kurgan, that's it. Yeah, Clancy
Kurgan,
Brown.
yeah.
Great actor. Christopher Lambert, not a great. Maybe the worst actor ever.
That's well. First off,
Pretty bad.
first off, your big respect and shouts out to our friend of the show, Garrett Hedlund.
Oh, come on. He's way worse than Garrett Hedlund. Come on.
No, I insist. I must insist. And all I have to do is point at Tron, and that's my Garrett Hedlund high five to close out 2023.
Fair enough.
You're always welcome to see him in Tulsa King, where he is now suddenly a Southern man from Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a thick accent.
I would like to think that Garrett Hedlund is also at the Disney World Resort as a cast member helping folks get into the ride.
What are you doing here, Alan? Back to Never Say Never Again. Schwartzman's career as a producer never really took off after this. He worked on a handful of films before actually passing away in 1994 from pancreatic cancer. But as far as the production of this film goes, I'm pretty sure that the first time I saw this movie as a kid, I just assumed that it was a TV movie because it looked so cheap. It had a bigger budget than Octopussy. It had the same budget as Return of the Jedi, which was released the same year. This is some of the worst cinematography I've ever seen for a movie of this budget, which is inexcusable to me because they hired Douglas Slocum, who had just finished shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is one of the best filmed movies ever. I can't explain this. This film has that soft, focused, fuzzy look that you see on TV from that era. All of the sets look cheap.
I was going to say, is that a factor of having all these TV guys involved with this? They had 2 TV writers. They had a bunch of the staff from Batman from the 60s, the TV show. Is that just a reaction or something happening because all these TV people were involved and they didn't have the movie-centric people? And I know they brought in people from Raiders of the Lost Ark,
I don't
some
know.
of these other movies, but it just seems like you have all these TV-centric people. And you said it there, the writers, the TV writers, were there every day writing stuff on the set. I'm sure they were more involved than just writing. I'm sure they're involved with the framing and the camera operating and all that stuff to get that stuff to be the way they wanted to match their vision of these movies. But it feels like it's you have a TV centric crew doing a lot of stuff that maybe that just rubs off.
I really don't know how to explain it. That could be it. But you'd think with the DP from Raiders of the Lost Ark, they hired art directors who had worked on that film. Irvin Kershner, who directed this, he was fresh off of directing The Empire Strikes Back. I think it's just a complete misallocation of money, probably due to the inexperience of Schwartzman. You know, Anton, the producer of a film is something we don't often talk about on these episodes. Maybe we should more, because this is a film when your lead actor is essentially functioning as a producer, it has to trickle down to every decision, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, one of the things that Bond films are famous for is like really cool production design. There's nothing interesting about the sets in this film. You know, some scenes it looks like it's filmed at like a community college lecture hall, or like there's scenes where Bond's on a computer and it looks like he's in the back room of a library. It doesn't even look like a movie set. The film opens like a TV movie. The title song sounds like a warbly cassette. It's like, it's just terrible audio. It's like a car stereo trying to play it.
Like Tyler mentioned earlier, a lot of audio ends up looking sounding a bit out of sync with the actors' mouths.
Yeah. Tyler, you mentioned in the opening action sequence when...
Oh, it's so bad.
Yeah. With the guns.
I think that sets a lot of the
gunfire.
tone. Yeah, again, you got a bunch of guys running around. The guns have no recoil. It's not realistic. The set, even for that intro scene where they're like in, what is it? It's like a village or something, and he's busting down the doors and all that stuff. Like the whole set looks bad. It looks like something again like out of a '90s TV show. It looks
I can do you one better on that. I was listening to the director's commentary of this. That wasn't even just a set. It was basically an abandoned house they found in the Bahamas when they were location scouting, and they just decided to film there. So they
Yeah, I
didn't
mean,
even have to build a set. It was just, let's just use this abandoned house.
there's one point where he's like hiding behind like a wicker door, and it's just like, what are you doing behind this wicker door? It's not stopping anyone from shooting you. The flashbang when he pops in there and everyone's suddenly blind, and he's just like one-handed shooting the machine gun. It doesn't come together well.
It's impossible not to compare this to Thunderball. Do you remember the Spectre boardroom scene in Thunderball? It's iconic. It's this really gunmetal, contemporary, mid-century looking room. Really cool, really memorable with, the chairs, and Blofeld is, you can't see his face. He's behind the screen, and there's the map of the world that's behind all of them. The Spectre boardroom in this film, it looks like the back room at a casino where you'd play a private poker game. It's just so uninteresting. The only set that I thought was really worth its money was the one in the climax, the Tears for Allah, the underground set. It looked pretty like Tomb Raider-esque, pretty cool looking, but that was it.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty cool, but even at the same time, just not as grandiose and as building a world for Bond to explore, as luscious and lively as we would expect from a Bond film.
And it's still super clear that it's a set. It's they're like,
yes,
they're filming this fight from different directions, but it's just the camera like moving around. Well, you can tell it's a half of a room basically. It's not like there's the blue screen or the green screen they use to give it like that full 360 effect. You can clearly tell that they're trying to hide the back half where the stage crew is and the movie crew is filming all this stuff.
And the rest of the production design, I think, suffers as well. Like those jet-powered things that Bond and Leiter fly out of the submarine, they look like they were made out of like Legos or like Kinects. Really cheap looking. The footage of the submarine traveling underwater, they didn't even have the budget to create footage themselves. That was taken from the 1968 film Ice Station Zebra. Really have to wonder where the money went here. And
went to Connery.
It went to Connery. It went to the reshoots. But here's the worst part. The worst thing about the film for me is the soundtrack.
So rough.
I was thinking about how I was going to talk about the music for this film with you guys, because I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but it honestly might be the worst music I've ever heard in a film. Maybe not the worst, but it's in the conversation. It is awful. Yeah, it's some kind of disco jazz fusion thing that belongs in like a porn movie on Cinemax. It's completely inappropriate for the film. It really made me think that it was like 3 or 4 different film scores like mashed together into whatever this is. And I don't understand, because Michel Legrand was a very experienced film composer. And this is garbage. The same goes for the song. The title song is just awful.
And those are 2 sins that you cannot commit when it comes to Bond films. It's just, it's iconic.
I do know they had to play with the opening a little bit because they couldn't contractually include the gun barrel scene. So they're trying to do something different. But this definitely was not it.
And it really does highlight how important music is to a film. Like, Tyler, we were talking before the recording how you thought some of the stuff in Thunderball was slow. And it is, I'll give you that. But you think about Thunderball, right? That's an iconic score from John Barry. And that's something you always get, or almost always get, with a Bond movie, right? Like, a lot of Bond movies have their faults, but almost all of them have incredible music to propel them along, right?
Thunderball especially. I think that was probably one of the better parts. It's just the musical cues. It's much more in the time. Having seen some of these older Bond movies, it suits the movie itself. It feels like it's part of the movie. It's almost, as integral as the kind of the one-liners that Bond always shoots out.
You can imagine how much better this would be with a John Barry score, and it's easy to do. You can find alternative versions of this film cut with Barry's music inserted. They're probably on YouTube. They're probably available, wherever you want to. I mean, it's essentially a bootleg what you're getting. It's not official, but it's interesting to hear if you ever check it out.
So you weren't kidding about the Bond people being pretty serious. They're rescoring entire films.
Yeah. Well,
and along those same notes, I was going to say, you may know, Pat, there was actually an alternative unused title theme that was written by Phyllis Hyman that they didn't end up using. So I'm curious if you have heard it.
I have heard an alternative version. I'm not sure who wrote it. I'm assuming it's the one
Yeah.
you're talking about.
It wasn't any better.
No, I mean, yeah. I mean, this is not exactly a hot take on my part. Like the score to this film is pretty much universally hated. I really do think it's the worst thing about the movie. The constant legal battles that the screenplay had to undergo, you can't overstate those either. It was a major handicap on this film's quality. The director's commentary, Kirshner was talking about the quality of the script affected some of the actors too. Like the pair of writers that Connery hired, they were later speaking about how Klaus Maria Brandauer, quote, didn't trust the script, end quote, and he just started doing his own thing, which I have to say I could totally see him doing that. He seems like, let's call him a wild card.
I did read a bit more about these guys and the way they go about acting. And Connery is much more of a just give me a few minutes and I'll come at you with the best I can, and I'll work with the other actors on set. And it sounds like Klaus Maria Brandauer was a little bit more of I need a firm script. I need to rehearse it a couple hundred times. There's no give and take in the script, and I want to be the best person in every scene. And Connery is very much the opposite. So I see having those two guys trying to compete for time and space and dialogue is when you have two actors that don't agree philosophically. I'm sure it's difficult to get them to have the best for either of them on screen at the same time.
Definitely. Number 2 reason why this wasn't better, the direction and the tone. You know, hearing that Richard Donner was offered this project, I have to wonder what that might have been like. Was Irvin Kershner the right director for this?
Good question. I mean, I think at the time, when you look at from the perspective of the studio, they wanted to compete with Octopussy, right? Or they wanted to be able to compete with the Eon production. And how do you do that? You make sure that, you know, you get Sean Connery as your Bond, and you hire big names. Irvin Kershner also was, I want to say, just barreling through the momentum of Empire Strikes Back. When you have a film like that, of course, that's a pretty hot director at the time. But of course, like you said, Richard Donner could have probably provided a very fun film.
I would have loved to have seen this directed by Donner. And it's nothing against Kershner. I really enjoyed his commentary track for this film. He seems like a really nice person. He had a lot of really nice things to say about Connery. But I do think he struck gold with The Empire Strikes Back. I haven't seen a ton of his films, so I don't want to be too harsh on him, but I would say between this and the only other film that I've seen of his, which is RoboCop 2, it's like I'm not sure he's great.
This and Empire Strikes Back are two substantially different movies, especially from from the type of movie they are to like the type of people in the movie. I mean, you have to think like all the people in Star Wars Empire Strikes Back were still kind of like no-name actors, not to say it like that, but like they weren't.
No, they were. You're right.
You weren't dealing with someone like Sean Connery, who's an established, 15 or 20-year veteran of this series at this point. And it's hard to believe that they would just like find this guy and be like, hey, one good movie, let's chuck him in. Realistically, the reason he ended up in Empire Strikes Back is because he was, a buddy to, all the Star Wars people. He's a buddy to Lucas and all these guys. And that's how you get roped into those things. Yeah, it's interesting to see some of that patriotism or whatever kind of stick to it in the way it does today. A lot of these guys getting movies because they do one good movie. They do one good indie movie, and all of a sudden they're in a Marvel movie with a $200 million budget when the last movie they directed had a $20 million budget or even less usually.
No, that's very fair to say. And
yeah, it's a good
especially
point.
looking at Empire Strikes Back, that's a bit of a perfect storm with, Kershner directing everything Industrial Light and Magic coming together. It's a pretty magical film. I feel like it's one of those things where probably the studio looked at, hey, let's get this guy who directed like one of the greatest films of all time, arguably.
Oh, I don't think arguably.
Yeah. And let's get him to direct. And not the same ingredients.
If you want to defend Kershner a bit, the book Battle for Bond, it details how he was, quote, thwarted at every turn, end quote. He frequently clashed with Schwartzman on set. Both men had, differing visions for the film, and the studio always sided with Schwartzman, the money guy, which really frustrated Kershner. He also found himself at odds with Sean Connery, who went so far as to take charge of certain scenes. Part of this was Kershner's fault, because he had asked Connery to challenge him, which Connery, you can picture Sean Connery. He has no problem challenging anyone. That being said, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but Kirshner has nothing but good things to say about Connery on the commentary track and ever since. He called him, quote, the greatest professional I've ever worked with. No matter what's going wrong, no matter what you're trying to do, he's there to help, end quote.
I guess another strange thing to me with this director is that Kirshner is an American person, an American man. I don't know why I said American person, but these Bond movies are like the core British movies, and it's crazy to me that they don't have a British director directing this movie. And every James Bond movie, it just seems like it would be more authentic that way. They catch more of the things that are British society than they would, having an American director who doesn't understand that. It doesn't have any reference to those things.
That's a really astute observation you made, Tyler, because up until the very last Bond movie, No Time to Die, Eon had made a point never to hire American directors. And at one point, Steven Spielberg wanted to direct a Bond movie, and Broccoli turned him down because he did not want an American directing it.
I feel like a lot of the British nuance goes MIA when there's not a British director helming a movie like this.
Yeah. I want to talk about the video game scene.
Oh my God.
This was Jack Schwartzman's idea. I find it both amazing and silly at the same time, and yet it's probably my favorite scene in the film.
Jeez.
Some of the obstacle effects are really awkward, especially when you watch this now, and I don't think I saw it in 4K, but Blu-ray for sure. The screen gets like darker randomly when the effects are taking place, but it is kind of cool to see Bond play a video game against the villain. Pretty unique, though. I mean, it stands out in the series. It's one of the most famous scenes that people remember from this film.
Having watched this, can you explain what that game is? Is it an underwater game where they're firing things at each other?
It's really hard to tell.
I don't know. I don't understand the electric shock part of it. That's just like an added layer. I did find it funny how Largo tells Bond, like, oh yeah, I designed it myself. You just invented this video game? Like, what? It's only available in this one room in a casino.
This dude's just playing it all the time, electrifying everybody he's playing against. He's like, yeah, I always win. Well, yeah, no shit. Everyone here is playing this game for the first time, and you're in your casino lair playing this game every day. No wonder you win every time.
I love how he gradually introduces him to the rules. Like, oh yeah, by the way, you get an electric shock, and oh, by the way, if you let go of the controls, you lose. Like, thanks. Thanks for telling me.
And of course, let's parallel this with the very famous scene from Thunderball. It's night and day, right?
Card games age so much better than this.
But to be fair, when you think about it from, okay, we're back in the 1980s, and arcade gaming is very lucrative, very relevant, and audiences would relate to that and say, oh yeah, that's what's popular right now. I mean,
I have to imagine Schwartzman's, walking through his house watching Jason Schwartzman play Pong or Atari or something, and going, "Oh man, that'd be awesome in my James Bond movie." And that's just what made this. Yeah, this is what turns into the movie. And to be fair, the Thunderball, the scene there where it's just like them playing poker with a bunch of people around, and then like again, that's like where the really felt James Bond kicks in Thunderball, where he's like, "Allow me to take your wife, girlfriend, fiance, niece, whatever, out, on me." And then the dude's just like, "Sure, take her." It's just like some of the greatest movie scene stuff from a Bond movie, and I think that is lacking in this movie. That feltness that he had there.
But hey, this time Connery wins, and he's like, "I just want to dance."
I did like the line he gives Largo. If you remember, Largo asks him, "Do you lose as gracefully as you win?" He goes, "I wouldn't know. I've never lost." Good stuff. The other strangest scene in the film to me, the shark scene.
Oh, the radio-controlled sharks?
Yes. First of all, they definitely killed some sharks for this, right? Like, that was pretty weird.
I think a horse probably a few horses too.
Yeah, the horse jump, that got a lot of criticism even at the time.
I'm guessing movies weren't working to have PETA sign off on them at the end of it back in the day here, huh?
Yeah, those sharks were not unionized.
I have to say, some of the, shall we say, assassination techniques in this film are Convoluted to the point where I feel like I'm watching The Naked Gun. I was gonna save this for later, but since we're talking about the shark things with the frickin' radio beams attached to them. So the part where Fatima Blush kills Jack Patachi, let's walk through this. She drives up next to him on a road. She throws a snake into his car, causing him to crash, which I think it looks like it killed him. And then she stops to retrieve her snake before blowing up the said crashed car with a bomb. There's just no way to take this seriously. And yet I love it.
I still don't know how she was nominated for anything in this movie. Because she's like she grabs him, the snake, and she's like, "Oh, my child," or whatever.
Yeah.
And she's just like, she has that crazy smile on her face, as if she didn't just run a dude off the road with a snake. Which it's a snake. Like, you just chuck it out of the car. It's not. I don't understand why this dude's freaking out about a snake.
His acting when the snake lands on his lap. Ah!
You could put Benny Hill music to it, and
it's so great.
It has a much more impactful.
I mean, don't get me wrong; it's terrible, but it's like it's so entertaining to watch.
Now, but is it the most head-scratching death in the film? Because I'd argue I had no idea what was going on in the attempted assassination at the health clinic in the beginning of the film, and the assassin's just hunched over after getting a substance thrown on his face, which I thought was acid.
Right. Did you recognize who that assassin was? Did either of you recognize him?
No, I didn't.
Okay. He is the Nazi mechanic in Raiders of the Lost Ark that Indiana Jones fights during the plane scene.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also the giant thuggy like slave master in Temple of Doom.
Seems to be a fun character actor.
Yeah. Well, I did like that fight in the clinic, though. I thought that was a pretty entertaining fight.
I mean, they do just destroy that whole clinic. And I think it's another one of those scenes where it's like these two dudes smashing around here break way more stuff than they should. You're just like, why are all these things shattering so easily? And also, why do they have all those chemicals and all those glass vials in what is essentially a spa? And like, why do they have some of Bond's urine in the spa? Like, what are they make mention of him having to cut back on red meat and white bread and all that stuff, but like, what are they wringing out with all that urine?
Right.
I'm just assuming his urine was just straight vodka at that point. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's like vodka, maybe some Quaaludes, and who knows what else. But like, what are you gonna do to get it to come out of there? It's just not. It's not normal that a spa would have all that stuff, let alone acid to burn that dude's face, and then he dies with a bunch of weird vials jammed in his back. And all he did was like lightly brush up against that the shelf.
Oh, it's so entertaining. So that shark scene, this was a big part of the book. That apparently cost a lot of money because the second unit, who were inexperienced, they filmed Connery's double for a number of shots underwater, only the double looked nothing like Connery. So Kirshner had to redo it himself with like an appropriately sized stunt double. It's just one more thing about, like, we were talking about, like, where the money went earlier. It's just like stupid stuff like this. Like, I can only imagine like filming on like a shipwreck underwater. It's not cheap. I do like how Bond is trying to find hijacked nuclear weapons, but he has time to go bang Fatima Blush on a boat and like, yeah, let's go scuba diving for a few hours. I've got time.
Yeah, well, I mean, they say he's got X amount of time. He's in no rush. He knows he's going to find them eventually.
He's also traveling with no real sense of why, or at least of the audience, why he ends up in certain places.
Worst case scenario, the British and U.S. government and NATO just has to pay Spectre, so whatever.
Oh, I've got questions about that. I'll bring that up a bit later. Yeah, I guess the action in here is pretty underwhelming because you think about the climax, right? Compare that to Thunderball. So in here, Anton, we talk about spatial geography occasionally on this podcast. The climactic battle here, right, on like the Tomb Raider set, we have a bunch of guys in black wetsuits shooting at another bunch of guys in black wetsuits. Just think about the underwater battle in Thunderball, right? The good guys are wearing orange, the bad guys are wearing black. Very easy to visually process, right? You have those really big overhead shots of the ocean and the guys scuba diving with all the submarines and stuff, the submersibles. Not so here. It's just black wetsuits versus black wetsuits. I'm kind of amazed that Kirshner didn't direct this, because that's like pretty basic stuff. Just put the two sides in different colors and it's way easier for the audience to tell who's who.
Right. And very poor cinematography, poor costuming. I mean, we already touched on the film looking a little dated, but I think this was just a good example of not really investing in pretty basic things that would have helped up the film a little bit in quality.
This has to be a place where they were saving money, because
Oh, yeah.
if they were to
Yes.
have 20 guys fighting on the beach somewhere, it would be way more visually appreciated, and you could have guys shooting and bad guys fighting. But in this, it's just like a bunch of dudes swimming with the spear guns, and the spears just like kind of lazily floating by and hitting people. It does not give off any of like the oomph that an actual hand-to-hand or a big battle would have. And if you have a bunch of guys just swimming in a pool somewhere, I think it's much easier to film and much easier to smudge some of that stuff over to make it look like it's exciting when it's not, as opposed to a bunch of dudes actually fighting hand-to-hand above the water.
There's not much tension in this climax either, right? Like in Thunderball, the stakes were very clear, right? Miami is going to be destroyed if they don't recover the nuclear bomb. Here, in Never Say Never Again, it's like we're in some underground cave system that M made a vague comment in the film earlier that it like may be connected to the Persian Gulf oil supply. It's not super clear though.
Right. And the tension isn't built. It's not, there's no urgency felt. I think Largo just casually explains the other nuclear warhead is under the White House.
Oh, that's right. He does say that. But they never follow up on that, really? Wait, do they say they recovered it?
I don't remember.
I don't even know.
I just
I've seen
remember
this movie
that,
like 30 times and I don't know.
I just remember that he just casually explained it. And I was like, oh, right. When did they do that? We didn't see that. And okay, I'll take your word for it.
I was going to say, they kind of gloss over the first warhead. Isn't it just like a phone call? And Bond is just like, yeah, they got it. No big deal.
I think so. Yeah.
And it's lighter. Felix is basically just like, hey, they got it. And then it's like, okay, well, let's go get this other one, I guess. With limited speed and rush behind it. It's just like, hey, we'll go deal with this over here.
We'll proceed at a leisurely pace. But Tyler, you were spot on about them running out of money. You can really see the exact point where they ran out of money. It's the end. Domino just appears out of nowhere and kills Largo with the spear gun. And then the movie just ends. She kills Largo, and then it cuts to her and Bond relaxing in the pool. Like, they were really, really out of money.
It's not good.
We're not trying. Well, we have no choice but to compare it to Thunderball, right? Like the end of Thunderball is. The editing is a little choppy, I think, but it's genuinely exciting and thrilling. And here, it just kind of fizzles out.
Even the fight at the end, where they're underwater and Bond and Largo are fighting, it's just all of a sudden there's another person with a spear gun. That's it, done.
Right.
And I don't quite understand why, when there's two, we'll call them small armies of men fighting. No offense to women everywhere, but in this day and age, for her to just pop out of nowhere with a wetsuit doesn't fit the theme of the rest of the movie, that all these men are doing all these things.
Right. Like in Thunderball, when Domino kills Largo from behind with the spear gun, like she had a reason to kill him. She was on the boat as his prisoner, right? Like there was a reason for her to be there. Here, I guess the captain of the submarine just gave Domino scuba gear and a spear gun and like, yeah, go with the Navy SEALs, just swim down that tunnel. Like there's really no explanation for her being there.
No. And something I did just want to mention there, Pat, you hit the nail on the head that we really haven't talked about the importance of producers enough on the podcast, or, it's a good opportunity to really mention this. A lot of the unevenness, like you said, it trickles down from decisions like producers mismanaging money, making decisions that end up just with a domino effect, right? And we're really seeing that because there was a lot of time that they didn't spend effectively and efficiently, and it ends up having to rush the film where we're in our seats just scratching our heads thinking, wait, how did we get here?
Indeed. The tone of this film is, I think, a bit erratic, but I think a lot of the comedy does work. Connery, he has some really good lines to deliver. It's actually some of my favorite one-liners in the entire series, and I think that's one of the pluses of this film.
Mm-hmm.
Tyler, you were starting to talk about the one thing when M tells him too much red meat and white bread and dry martinis. And he just says, then I shall cut out the white bread, sir. Great line. This is my favorite one. Mr. Bond, I believe I'm having you in a half an hour. Ah, splendid. Your room or mine. Q tells him, I do hope we're going to see some gratuitous sex and violence. I certainly hope so too. Ah, I've made you all wet. Yes, but my martini's still dry. That's an amazing line. When he walks into the massage clinic thing, do you serve men here? Yes, some men more than others. And then Anton, you were bringing this up earlier. Well,
Yeah.
there was this girl in Philadelphia.
Shout out Philadelphia.
Pretty great.
Yeah, shouts out Philly.
It's pretty great lines. I did like the bit when, he's essentially gate crashing the Largo's charity ball, and he leaves the maitre d' in the closet with what he tells him it's a bomb in his cigar case.
Right.
It's pretty awesome gag.
And not only is it's a bomb, but he has to hold it in a particular way.
That,
otherwise, it'll go off. And so he's just stuck in that position the whole time.
That is one of those bits where the fact that they film him going back and grabbing the case and then the dude passing out is just such a Bond scene that you wouldn't see. Any other movie, they would have just forgotten about him. And they would have never addressed that guy stuck being in the closet. But they make sure to go back to tell you that Bond did not, A, let this guy die, and B, went to recover his stuff before he left. It's just like nobody would follow up on a dumb joke like that in just about any other movie. And here they are, just letting it happen.
It's a great payoff. And, the lines that you mentioned, Pat, it's fantastic dialogue, but anyone else other than Sean Connery, and it's hard to still get the same payoff.
100%. We talked about it on the Rising Sun episode, how he is just able to sell these one-liners and these situations that would be ridiculous with almost any actor, but Connery has the charisma to pull this stuff off, and that's what makes him who he was. That's why he's a legend. All right, here's some questions. There's some throwaway lines in here that they just never follow up on it and crack me up. His left eye is an exact duplicate of the President of the United States. Well, how did they do that? It's like a fairly big deal. It's never brought up again in the film. And even when Bond, do you remember when Bond suggests this to M? Was it possible he could have used a false eye? And he's like, oh, do come along, Bond.
It's a little confusing.
The hijacking in Thunderball makes way more sense, where they basically got a guy to have plastic surgery as as doppelganger. That was just the whole eye scan thing is pretty crazy. And also the president apparently has the same eye as a giant squid. It's this gigantic blue eye.
I think that's a lot of just bruising from having your eye beat up so that they can make it look like the president's eye. But
that makes sense.
Because a bit of the character background in Thunderball, where the guy is I want more money, and then they kill him off. Even that just gives a little extra depth to the movie that this movie just totally doesn't acknowledge. Yeah, it's just a dude on drugs in this movie, basically.
Yeah, they get him addicted to heroin.
Yeah.
Heroin. The novel's plot makes way more sense, and I don't know why they just didn't use it. So in the novel, it's way more straightforward. They just bribe Domino's brother to do it. That's it.
Makes sense.
There's no doppelganger. There's no getting him addicted to heroin. They just pay him a lot of money to help them steal the nukes, and he does it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's your sister who's dating this guy, and the guy is just I got an opportunity for you, that seems pretty reasonable, pretty believable. And it's just not. It's much more far-fetched in both of these movies.
Yeah. Tyler, you were touching on this earlier. Spectre's ransom demand is, quote, 25% of your country's respective oil purchases, end quote. How would that work? How would that get paid out? How would an underground criminal organization handle that?
I mean, can we just talk about Spectre?
Venmo.
Yeah, can we just talk about Spectre as a whole? Because Spectre itself, Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion, is a dumb name. And it's... I can't get past them just having that as the name of the organization. I get it. It's a cool little, name to give your organization. But even the name is just goofy. And then the demand they have is also goofy. And I know this plays right into Austin Powers and all of the dumb stuff that Dr. Evil does and all that. It's all been kind of discussed in those movies, but it's just, again, something so stupid as 25% of your country's respective oil purchases.
How does that work?
do they have an economist on staff who's measuring that? And it's just like, oh yeah, this guy over here, number 7 or number 11, he does all the economizing for Spectre, and he's the one who's going to figure this out. At least in Thunderball, it's like a number and it's diamonds.
Right,
It's
$100
very
million.
clear. Yeah, it's very clear what they want and how they want it and how they're going to get it to them. And this movie is just like, well, we could just nationalize the amount of oil purchases and just say, all right, well, we only spent $100 on oil last year. Here's $25.
Right. I don't even understand how that would work. Like, what are they gonna? They're gonna ship Spectre oil? Like, how does that? I just don't understand it.
I think it's monetary. So they want the monetary value of 25% of your country's respective oil purchases.
Which one of the ministers claims that would be $25 billion a year. Again, like how would they, like, what would Spectre do with that money?
Yeah, and it's not like current days when there's the bank accounts that exist in the internet. There's no way to like zip that money back and forth. You can't write a check because you can't cash that check anywhere.
Right.
You can't take a stack of cash because they cover it in Breaking Bad. A couple $1 million is like a couple pallets worth of cash. So you can't just move that somewhere.
No.
Not to mention we don't have $25 billion in U.S. currency laying around, or British pounds laying around, or euros now laying around. So that it's a funny number. And again, right back to Austin Powers, where they're just making up numbers. $100 trillion, and then they all just laugh at them because the money doesn't exist.
No, and I think the problem is the three of us just put more thought into this than they did when they were writing that part of the script. That's my theory on it. Yeah, I think ultimately, I think the tone of this film, it is hit or miss. There is stuff that doesn't work well. Some of the stuff has aged horribly. Like when Bond tricks Domino into thinking he's the masseuse, like that's sexual assault. It's awkward to watch.
A little dated.
Just a little, yeah. And the fact that she's like kind of turned on by it when the masseuse tells her like, well, that guy doesn't work here. She's like, oh, really?
That's one of those. You can tell that no woman was asked about the writing in this movie when
I was going to say, maybe a Harvard grad wrote that scene right out of college, first writing gig.
And then Largo selling Domino to a band of Arabs is just bizarre. It's unnecessary for the plot. There's a million different perilous situations he could have put her in. I always forget about it too when I rewatch this movie, because this is kind of where the movie starts to lull a little bit. Like, he's trying to sell her to a bunch of Arabs for whatever reason.
I understand they're trying to reinforce like where this place is, but it is, again, another one of those things where it's just like if a woman looked at that and saw the way it was written, they'd just be like, yeah, they're selling them to the Arabs. And it would not fly. It also wouldn't make sense to just not kill her. Like, what are the Arabs going to get you? A couple dollars when you can just be done with this woman? Again, more of the Austin Powers thing, where it's, why don't you just kill them? I just go to my gun right now and get a gun and shoot him in the head and he's dead. Instead of, the laser-equipped sharks or selling them to the Arabs.
And again, Thunderball handles this way better. If you remember, Bond gives Domino that camera that's a Geiger counter. She goes back on the boat. Largo catches her, and then he basically threatens her by saying, I'm going to torture you and kill you if you don't tell me what Bond knows. Logically makes sense for the plot, right? There's like a real reason for her being in a perilous situation. There's a reason for her being on the boat in the end. She is Largo's prisoner. Here, there's no need for her to be on that submarine.
Zero.
But Tyler, you hinted this a couple times, how the writing challenges. There was different writing. There was different writers on set. There was multiple drafts. Every minor change had to go through the team of lawyers who had to scrutinize it to make sure there wasn't a copyright issue because of the constant threat of an Eon lawsuit. Every single line of dialogue that was changed had to go through this multi-step approval process, and that would have trickled down as well. Number 3 reason why this wasn't better. I want to talk about the performances. On the commentary track, Irvin Kershner was talking about the difference between Sean Connery and Klaus Maria Brandauer. How Connery will try to involve other actors around him and play off them, like a sort of a teamwork approach. And Brandauer would use other actors around them to his advantage. Anton, we have used this quote before on other episodes talking about the acting differences, because I had written this one down a long time ago because it always stuck with me. And it's I think it's a really interesting way to look at actors giving performances in films. This quote has stuck with me so much, I almost sort of think about it every time I watch a movie at this point now. He said, quote, Sean needs very little direction after the rehearsal. He very rarely misses a beat. Someone like Klaus needs very careful handling. He'll go too far and almost make a caricature out of it. Because his range is so great, he can do anything you want. Sean is not competitive with other actors. He works with other actors. He's very generous with others. Klaus is trying to be the best. He's trying to compete with those around him. He doesn't work with other actors. He uses them, end quote.
Yeah, I think that very perfectly captures everything that we see on screen, and it doesn't surprise me.
I have to say, if you are going to give this film props for anything, Connery does not disappoint here at all. In spite of his age being 52, I think he gives a fantastic performance here. He wears the suits effortlessly. He delivers all of the lines expertly. I think he looks really fit. He's in way better shape than he was 12 years earlier for Diamonds Are Forever. I think his wig's pretty bad here. It's pretty bad toupee. But I don't know. I just think it's so awesome to see him back in this role, in this one-off unicorn of a film.
Right, and we do have to give that due credit that they made the right decision. Like, if they were going to make this film, they had to get, well, they were like, we're intent on bringing back Sean Connery, and they did it. It would not have worked with anyone else.
I think the only reason this movie actually works is because of Connery. I think if you had another actor in there, and I know they had considered other actors in the past, as they were doing this movie to do the Bond role, they pull him in and they do some of the jokes about him being older and about him not being as healthy and all that stuff. Again, that's the only reason this really works. And I know we'll talk about some of the other acting in this movie that is not as good, but I think he definitely sells the movie, and certainly is the best part of the movie. Even if, from my perspective, he is definitely old. Like you mentioned, the toupee is very bad. The hair does not look good. I kind of feel like they maybe should have just given him some of the Connery hair. I know Connery's got the horseshoe going, but I think it would have been a little better than the rug they strapped on his head for this.
Yeah, it almost looks like he's wearing a helmet in some of the scenes. Yeah, this film lives or dies with him. You know, without him, it just doesn't work. My other favorite performance in the film, though, Brandauer as Largo. Charming, witty, but you can see the psychopath bubbling under the surface. I think he does a really good job of playing it subtly. There's a few scenes where he comes dangerously close to dialing it up to 11, just like Barbara Carrera, who we'll get to. But he backs off at the last second. He knows just when to hold back. I really like what he's doing here. He seems like a total weirdo, and I could understand the earlier quote we were talking about how he just did whatever he wanted with the script. I can totally see him being that kind of actor, but I think he's great in this role.
He has this cruel smile when he's beating Bond the video game the first time before Bond beats him. He's watching Bond just get zapped, and he's just smiling. And it's such a creepy smile, and it's such a villain smile, and it's such a perfect fit for this. I will say it, though, I do think that number 2 from Thunderball is a little bit better. The eye patch sells it for me, and having no eye patch in this movie, I think, is a great loss.
Have either of you seen Mephisto?
No.
I've not.
Yeah, I haven't either, but thinking looking into the research into the film and thinking about Klaus and how great he was in Mephisto based on critical acclaim, probably good to visit because he was able to bring that nice subtlety to the character.
He's been in a few different things. Brandauer was nominated for an Oscar for his performance in Out of Africa a couple years after this. He's really good in that film. He is in another film with Connery in 1990 called The Russia House, which is one of my all-time favorite Connery performances. It's based on a John le Carré novel. And here's a bit of movie trivia for you both. Connery replaced him on The Hunt for Red October as Ramius. He was originally supposed to be the Soviet submarine captain. He backed out of the role at the last minute, and just before shooting began, Connery took over.
Oh man, I don't think that would be the movie it is without Connery.
Right?
He is just like the switch over from Russian to English in that movie, and Connery is believable as a Russian sub-captain more so than just about anybody else. I don't think that movie would have been nearly as good as it was without Connery.
That's honestly might be my favorite movie. I adore that movie. Oh, really quick about Brandauer in this film as Largo. So when he first appears on screen in like the Spectre boardroom, when he's on the wall screen, he's wearing a V-neck sweater, a popped collar, and a cravat. Insane. just to let you know that this guy's insane. And he's got the huge 80s like sunglasses on. Just incredible.
I mean, the cravat gives him such an air of aristocracy. You know, such an upscale gentleman.
It's not a common look nowadays.
No. Barbara Carrera, what do we think?
Over the top, is that fair?
Very fair.
I honestly just such an incredible psychopath in this movie. The whole like write it down thing is just such an funny scene.
It's amazing.
And then I mean, it's just like we talked about earlier, the snake thing. You know, she pulls the snake out of there. She's just like, my child. It's just like, are you serious? You just threw him into a car and crashed the car, and now you have such reverence for the snake that should have definitely been dead in that car crash because it almost killed a human being. I don't know.
It was a very memorable performance because of how over the top it was, and I don't think it was I'd say a great performance, but it was definitely very memorable.
Yeah, I think it works for the film. She does have really good chemistry with Connery. The scene, yes, her death scene where she tries to get him to write how she's the best sex he's ever had. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty good stuff.
And then she blew up.
Anton, did you text me about her pirate costume that she's wearing?
Yeah, I was like, why is there a pirate in this film?
Unbelievable. All of her outfits in this film are outrageous. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say there was some cocaine involved with her performance.
I have to imagine there was cocaine involved with everyone's performance in this movie.
It was the 1980s.
And did either of you notice this? When they're trying to trap Bond on the motorcycle in the back of the truck, she apparently hired the village people to try to get him in there. It's all these guys in like leather motorcycle gear. It's like, what the hell is this?
That's right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a very memorable death scene. I have to give her credit. Anton, I think you said it well. I don't know if it's a great performance, but it sure is memorable. The whole scene where she's beating up Jack when she catches him smoking. She's like beating him, and then she offers to give him heroin. It's just like outrageous.
I mean, that whole scene where she's at the window and you can just see her beating the shit out of this guy. And then she pulls the shade down and she's still beating the shit out of this guy. It's just...
His acting's terrible. Oh, a man at the window. Ah.
Not nearly as well fleshed out as the same character from Thunderball. It's crazy that they wouldn't have given him more room to play with and maybe gotten a better actor.
Kim Basinger, she looks great. I think she's kind of vanilla. I think she's fine here. Acceptable. I don't know how much chemistry she has with Connery. I don't like her nearly as much as I do Domino and Thunderball.
No, I agree with that. It's does not compare, but this film was fantastic for her career, right?
Yeah, this would have been her like breakout, right? This was like way before Batman.
Yes. So this was her third film. First film was in 1981, Hard Country. There was this film, and critically, she was received very well, and she was very, very popular. 2 decades after, and she's in big films, big Hollywood name,
Oscar winner,
and Oscar winner, and like we said, Vicky Vale in Batman.
I have to say, whoever wrote her character, they apparently never had a sip of alcohol. Did you notice this in the bar at the casino? Her character orders a double Bloody Mary with plenty of Worcestershire sauce at night. That's disgusting.
A recipe for heartburn.
Disgusting. No one drinks Bloody Marys past noon.
It's like if someone went to a baccarat table and ordered pina colada with extra whipped cream.
Right. Has that happened to you? Have you done that?
I've done that.
You ordered that at a casino? Bold.
I've done that. And hey, I won that hand. So
fair enough.
Let me get a creamy pina colada.
Was that good at a casino?
No, I originally ordered it as a joke, but
okay.
She left before I could order something else.
Like, no. You just be like Bond and order vodka on the rocks. Like that's going hard. The rest of the performances, I think they're very uneven. I did really like Bernie Casey as Felix Leiter. He's one of my favorite Felix Leiters in the whole series. It really seemed like he and Connery were friends. Because, when you watch the old Bonds, some of the Felixes are pretty forgettable. I think he's one of the best ones.
Really good chemistry.
Yeah.
Took me a while to place where I'd seen this guy before, but Revenge of the Nerds and Spies Like Us just popped right into my head as soon as I saw it. I couldn't think about it anymore.
Yeah, Anton, you may remember him. He had a really good role in Star Trek.
Trying to recall.
He was an admiral who joined that the Maquis the Resistance fighters.
We're going to have to discuss this, and I'll rewatch the episode.
Yeah,
I'm
this
not
is a
remembering
deep
it right
cut,
now,
and
but
yeah, he has a really good role on Star Trek. Bernie Casey, look him up.
definitely will.
Edward Fox as M. I really like the actor Edward Fox.
Mm-hmm.
If any of the listeners have seen Day of the Jackal, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, he is amazing in that movie. He's basically the Terminator. He's really good in A Bridge Too Far. I don't really like him here as M, though. He's just kind of stuffy, this like stiff upper-lipped bureaucrat. Kind of a just nothing role. I'm not a fan.
I will say that M's performance, I thought he was a bit of a jerk. Like when I think about M in James Bond in general, he can be hard on Bond, right? But I wouldn't I definitely got the sense that he was just kind of being a jerk in this film.
I think we even noted a little bit here, but he's bringing the Double O's back after he's seemingly retired them. Isn't he supposed to be like a bit more of a modern M as opposed to the let the Double O's do what they want series of M's where, oh yeah, they'll just save the world. This is like maybe the Double O's have just been a bunch of drunken fools for the last 20 years, so maybe we shouldn't use them anymore kind of guy.
That's fair.
They just don't have any relationship. Like, to your point, Anton, Bond and M, their relationship isn't always perfect, but there's always some kind of arc. Like when Judi Dench took over with Pierce Brosnan, right? She made comments about how she didn't really approve about she calls him a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. And they have this great little, dialogue. But then at the end, when he leaves her office, she kind of gives him a smile behind his back to show that she trusts him, right? There's nothing like that here. But to your point, Tyler, maybe that's what they were trying to do. But he just came across as boring to me. Rowan Atkinson, I don't know why he's in the movie. It doesn't really add anything. It's his first film, which is kind of cool. Anton, you made the Johnny English connection. It's cool to see him in a film like this early in his career, but you could have cut him out because this is not a short movie.
Do you want another Johnny English connection?
Yes.
Edward Fox actually was in the Johnny English sequel in 2018.
Oh, man.
Yeah, deep cut.
Yeah, he's pretty old at this point, right?
Yes.
All this happens before Mr. Bean, right? I'm very familiar with Mr. Bean.
This is way before Mr. Bean. Yeah,
loved Mr. Bean when I was a kid, but
yeah, he would have been well known for being starring in that series Blackadder at this point. That was around this time, but yeah, this was his first film.
One could argue that they were going for shoehorning in more comedy in this film, and I guess Rowan Atkinson tracks with that same mentality. If you're going to throw a snake at someone to take them out, might as well throw in Mr. Bean as well.
Fair enough. I found all of the smaller supporting roles pretty poorly acted. The guy that plays Domino's brother, his acting was pretty bad. Mm-hmm. A man at the window. The scene with all the NATO leaders listening to the ransom tape and when they start arguing, I just thought it was really poorly acted. Again, these are not big roles, but I think we take little roles like this for granted in films. It all came across as just TV level acting to me. And then this is the biggest one, Blofeld. Part of the reason this movie exists is due to the rights of Blofeld. And they give us the driest, most boring interpretation of the character. And they manage to waste the talents of one of the most acclaimed actors of the 20th century. Max von Sydow in this movie comes across as somebody's grandfather. It's the most unmemorable Blofeld I can think of.
You mean Vigo?
It's just such a waste. He's such a famous actor. He's been in so many great roles over the years. You would think him playing an iconic villain like Blofeld would give us some iconic stuff. It looks like he's reading off cue cards.
It's almost like a spy film with James Bond Easter eggs because you get the symbols, right? There's the cat, all of the James Bond tropes, but then you realize, oh right, this is actually a James Bond film, but it just doesn't deliver quite the same. And like you said, a complete waste of his talent.
That about wraps it up for the reasons of why this wasn't better. We talked about the production, how cheap the film looks. We talk about the director, Irvin Kershner, the uneven tone of this film. I do think it's a little long. It's like 135 minutes. It's getting up there. There's some things they could have trimmed. There's some scenes that I think are a little slow. And then, we talked about the acting. Before we rate this film and wrap this up, I did want to explain how the Thunderball saga ended. In the 1990s, Kevin McClory announced his plans to make another adaptation of the Thunderball story titled Warhead 2000 AD, but the film was scrapped. In 1997, Sony acquired McClory's rights for an undisclosed amount and subsequently announced that it intended to make a series of Bond films, as the company also held the rights to Casino Royale. However, they ended up trading the rights to Casino Royale for Spider-Man with MGM. McClory died in 2006, and MGM's acquisition of the rights to Casino Royale finally allowed Eon Productions to make a serious, non-satirical film adaptation of the novel that same year with Daniel Craig as James Bond. Ultimately, in 2013, McClory's estate sold the Thunderball rights back to Eon. They sold the Thunderball rights to Eon, allowing the company to reintroduce Blofeld to the official series, which would ultimately happen in Spectre, which was released in 2015. So that was about a 40-plus year legal battle. And let's bring this home, gentlemen. It's time to rate this. Do either of you have anything to add before we do so?
One thing I wanted to comment, we're probably never going to see anything like this again, right?
Definitely not. This is a unicorn.
Right. And I just want to really hammer that home for listeners that it's incredible that this film was even made, that the stars aligned, that Sean Connery was back in the saddle as James Bond. It may not have worked out depending on one's perception of the film, but it is just kind of amazing that this film was put together.
I'd be content to say that the closest thing we'll see to it is actually right now with Netflix making all these Rebel Moon movies that were originally designed to be Star Wars movies. And you see every bit of the Star Wars movie in them, except it's not called Star Wars. They even have lightsabers. So just taking artistic liberty with somebody else's idea and making a movie out of it, more or less. And I think this, and I'll discuss it when we get into the did we like it portion of this and we rate the movie, but this is basically like taking a movie and making it for shits and giggles.
Well, Tyler, you're the guest. Would you like to go first?
Certainly. I think I mentioned at the intro of this movie, or at the podcast, that I watched these movies, Thunderball and Never Say Never Again, within probably a 4-day span. I watched Never Say Never Again and I watched Thunderball. They don't compare to me. Thunderball is a substantially better movie to me. I like the action a little bit better. I like the reality of it a little better. Again, we talked about it with like the card game instead of the video games. I think it's just a more eternal portion of the film than having a bad video game kind of be the core part of how you introduce your hero to the villain in the movie. It's just not good. Pat and I have discussed it a little bit, prior to this, but like I hate to say it, but the beauty of the women in Thunderball is substantially higher. They have better roles or more intricately involved with what's happening in the movie, I think, in Thunderball. Overall, it's strange to me that they felt the need to remake the movie just because they had the rights to the movie. And again, we talked about it before. You have 10 years to write a movie, and this is the best you can come up with, is a lightly rehashed version of the same thing. Again, your saving grace here is that you got Connery to come back and do this. I don't think if they had made this movie with anybody other than Connery, we'd even be talking about it right now. I don't think it would have had the same emotional appeal to audiences. I don't think it would have come across as well as it did. And I think the biggest miss is probably that we talked about in the intro is that, Connery didn't have a chance to sit there and have the conversation with the other Bond at the end of the movie with the wink and nod and, Never Say Never Again. I think that probably would have been the best ending for this movie. And he probably wouldn't have done it free of charge to save them a few bucks on their already stretched budget in this movie. Overall, I just, again, the eye patch did it for me in Thunderball. I definitely think number 2 and all that stuff is a little bit cooler. I think the guy getting roasted in the chair in the first few minutes of Thunderball, I think, is awesome too. I don't feel like this movie has the same, I don't want to call it gravitas, but gravitas that Thunderball did. It's kind of baffling to me that they would need to make this movie. Overall, I'd probably give this a D. Probably my lowest of any of these movies done so far, which is, in my opinion, unfortunate. Again, as I've started to watch these movies, I definitely do like them. I have a higher opinion of them than I probably expected I did when I come into it. But I don't consider this a rewatchable movie. I'd much rather watch Thunderball over and over again.
I was going to ask, what would you rate Thunderball?
Thunderball is a B for me. I think it's, again, it drags and it's a lot, and the underwater fights aren't, like this movie, aren't exciting, but it's, looking at it now, it's a good, solid movie. Again, it doesn't feel out of place like this one does, again, with like the bad video games and all that stuff and the kind of bad underwater scenes and the bad sets. I liked And Thunderball, them hiding the plane, landing the plane in the water, and all that stuff was a little bit more believable than a lot of this other stuff. Maybe the least believable part about Thunderball was that the plastic surgery was good enough to make people look exactly alike in the whatever era that movie came out in.
I don't have a counter to anything that you're saying. I think a D for this film is fair. I rate it higher, but everything that you just said is fair. One of the questions I was going to ask, but you already answered it, would be does this film improve on anything from Thunderball? And Tyler, I agree with you. It does not. This is inferior to Thunderball in any way. I will say I think Connery's performance is outstanding, and it's probably every bit as good as he was in Thunderball, because that was really peak Connery for his James Bond career. I really do like Brandauer as Largo, but do I like him better than Adolfo Celli in Thunderball? I don't know. This is a really flawed film. The script is a mess, particularly in the third act. The movie just kind of ends. The production, it really just looks like a TV movie, considering who filmed it and the budget that they had. There's no excuse for how poor this film looks. There's certain scenes where they might have had like nylon stockings over the camera. That's how weird it looked to me. The music, it's the worst, I think, of the entire Bond series, and it's some of the worst film music I've ever heard. Connery really does save it. He delivers. It is a joy to see him back in the role. He's got some amazing lines. I do like some of the humor in here. I think some of that stuff really works. Barbara Carrera is very memorable. Kim Basinger is good enough. It's certainly unique enough that I think it was really fun to discuss. And I do rewatch this movie once in a while. But we were only going to get one of these, considering the legal hurdles. It's a miracle it even got made. I do think it is worth it alone just to see Connery back in the role at his age. But this is pretty mid for me. It's not great. It's not terrible. I rated a C, and I think I might be a little generous. I think Connery's performance is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, but C for me.
As we've all touched on, it has to be compared to Thunderball, and I think that's a little hard. I mean, that's doesn't give a good fighting chance for Never Say Never Again if you have to go up against, in many circles, like very top tier Bond. And when I think about that, just putting them pound for pound, how do we compare these films? It's not even close. But if the film didn't have Connery, this film wouldn't have a fighting chance. But because Sean Connery is James Bond, I still ended up having a good time watching it. Now, I knew it was a bit of a mess of a film, and going through, you definitely scratch your head as it's a little uneven. You don't know where some of the scenes just maybe missed a scene or two to connect them, or even to make sure that the plot made a bit more sense. But at the same time, I had myself having a good time. Some of the humor was very memorable. Performances were memorable. And while not perfect, it was still a Bond film, and may not be Eon Productions Bond, but fair to say the charisma of Sean Connery in the role of Bond again really was fantastic to see. And I have to also just, hammer home again, it's just fantastic. And I want to say that in the sense of fantastical. Like, it is astounding that all the elements had to come together, of course, of the court case, the legal battle, to even create this film. So just due respect on the side that like something like this happened. But all that aside, I still enjoyed it. Is it something that I'll watch again? Probably, but not as frequently as I would some of the more top tier Bond films. So for me, it's a C. And I agree with Pat, maybe I'm being a bit generous, but I do think that Connery really does it for me in this film.
All right. Well, that is it for Never Say Never Again. We will be back next week with our first and only animated film of the season. As Anton, we are going to be celebrating our 50th episode.
50th anniversary for us.
Yes, episode anniversary.
Yes, episode anniversary.
It is. Our intention is to discuss the 1978 animated version of The Lord of the Rings, which I have not seen since I was a child. So I am curious to revisit it, even though my memory of it is that it was not great.
Well, let me get my passport ready because we're headed to Middle Earth.
Yeah, that's right. And that's it. Yeah. We will see everyone next week.
Yeah.
Happy New Year, everyone. Tyler,
Happy
once
New Year.
again, thank you for joining
Appreciate
us.
it,
We're going to
guys.
have you back soon.
Yeah, one final thought, and I'll say this and I mean it. We all know this isn't the actual last James Bond film for Connor. We all know that it's The Rock. I'll put that out there. I'll let you guys debate that, but we all
There
know
we go.
that's the actual final Sean Connery Bond film.
There's a lot of evidence to support that. And for what it's worth, that is a much better movie than this. The Rock is probably one of the best action movies ever.
But thanks again for having me, guys. You know, I always enjoy doing this.
And we love having you.
And we will see you all next time on Why Wasn't It Better?